One mic, one voice. You can change the world, it's your choice. One mic, one voice. You can change the world, it's your choice. One mic, one voice. You can change the world, it's your choice. One mic, one voice.
Welcome to the One Mic, One Voice show, building the collective conscious. Show that's created to give space where your voice, ideas, and informed opinions can be heard, appreciated, and debated. I am Michael Eric Owens. Man, I'm back in the studio. I'm extremely excited about our guest today. Folks, you know what? I'm always trying to bring about something that educates us, that grows our understanding, not just of who we are, but this world that we live in today. And folks, I have an exciting guest. He's a busy man, but he put some time aside to talk to us about Haiti. And I'm with Brian Concannon. He is a human rights lawyer and foreign policy advocate. He's executive director of Project Blueprint, which works for a human rights-based U.S. foreign policy by bringing the perspectives of people abroad impacted by U.S. policy into policy discussions and advocacy. Brian founded the Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti. Brian, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me on, Michael. I'm really looking forward to this discussion.
Well, you know, I track you down. You know, I was like this, like this thoroughbred, and I track you down. I heard you being interviewed on a national broadcast, and some of the things you were sharing were just fascinating to me. And I thought, if I can get him on the broadcast, it'd be worth my effort. So first of all, thank you for being here. And just briefly in our conversation, you lived in Haiti for a while.
I did. I lived there from 1995 until 2004, which was really an exciting period in my life. Living in Haiti was a privilege and a blessing because people are so committed to justice, so committed to democracy. And that was actually a period where Haiti had an interval of peacefulness, of building democracy. I mean, it wasn't perfect, but it really had progress across the economy, education, healthcare, and in my work with the justice system. So that was, an exciting time to be there. It makes it sad that Haiti is still 20 years later is still in tough straits.
And, you know, I've had the opportunity to visit there. I really enjoyed my time. But, you know, most of the stuff we hear about the country is turmoil. We don't hear about its history, its culture, its greatness. I want to talk just briefly about that history, and especially as it relates to the United States.
Yeah, that's infinitely fascinating. I was an American history major in college and learned nothing about Haiti in that time, even though Haiti has had a huge impact on our country. Just for starters, close to half of the continental U.S. we got because France had lost its war in Haiti, so it had to give us the Louisiana Purchase. The Haitians really get an assist on that. But really, throughout U.S. history, Haiti has always played some kind of an important role, just as we have played and continue to play an important role in Haitian history, not always the best possible role.
Yeah, talk about some of those roles that are not so popular for the American image.
Haitians will when asked that question, will always start at 1803. And in 1803 or 1804, Haiti became independent, and that was the second independent nation in the hemisphere. The first independent nation, obviously, was the United States. And we said in our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution, we said lots of great things about democracy and liberty. And Haitians felt that the first independent country would welcome the second independent country. That wasn't true. The U.S. welcomed Haiti by putting an embargo on the country, by refusing to recognize Haiti for 61 years. And the reason why they did that was that Haiti became independent through a slave rebellion. I mean, not only did they free themselves, they beat Napoleon at his prime, one of the more impressive military victories in the history of the world. And obviously an important sort of social victory and justice victory that you went from freed slaves to running their own country. But of course, the United States still had slavery at the time. A big part of its economy, both North and South, was based on slavery. And we literally could not afford to allow Haiti to succeed, because that would completely erode the underpinnings of our economy, which rested on our ability to convince ourselves that somehow slavery was appropriate, despite the obvious horror of it. And so we did not recognize Haiti until a few weeks after President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And of course, there's no accident to that. But even though we recognized Haiti in 1864, we still have done many things that undermined Haiti. And one incident that's been coming up lately, especially with the assassination of President Moïse, is the issue of the American occupation. Until Afghanistan recently passed Haiti, Haiti had the longest U.S. occupation of any country. U.S. Marines occupied Haiti from 1915 until 1934. We built roads, we built buildings, but we did not leave Haiti any more democratic than when we found it. In fact, the United States imposed a constitution on Haiti that gave foreigners more power within the country. It decided who got to be president. And briefly, in order to build those roads, it reinstituted a form of slavery. And so we really had an opportunity and time to help build a more prosperous in Haiti, but instead we mostly put in an army that we could later control. That was involved in many reversals of presidents who were subsequently elected, but who the United States decided were not serving U.S. interests. Another big inflection point in terms of U.S. involvement in Haiti. I mentioned that I left in 2004, and that was because Haiti's experiment in democracy was ended when President Bush decided he did not like Haiti's President Aristide's economic policies, and this was not socialism. This was not being as free market as President Bush would have liked. President Aristide was not privatizing things as fast as he wanted. He was insisting on a greater state role in public life, including increased education and healthcare expenditures, which were certainly justified in a country that had less than 50% literacy. But that was against what President Bush felt was best for Haiti. So Haiti's President Aristide was literally pushed onto a plane. It was a U.S. plane that had filed an illegal flight plane, and it was a type of planes that they were using for the rendition of torture suspects during the so-called War on Terror. And President Aristide was whisked out to exile in the Central African Republic. That brought an end to Haiti's 10-year-long experiment in democracy. And to a large extent, what we're seeing now is a direct result of that. Haiti never recovered the level of democracy it had before the U.S. overthrew it in 2004. And one of the sad things is, I was in Haiti first with the United Nations, and I was part of this group of people from the international community, including U.S. government people, including UN people, people from France, Canada. We really felt that Haiti had a chance to develop a democracy, and we felt that the international community could play an important role. And I think we were right at the time. It just happened that eventually the United States decided that Haiti's democracy was not what the U.S. wanted. And so we ended up pulling the rug out from under something that we had helped build. And that obviously caused great harm to Haitian people for a long time.
Wow, that is, it's disturbing on one hand. And it begs the question to me, why? And when I heard you talk about, you were asked the question about what does the United States want out of Haiti? What is it, resources? Is it this? And when you said this, my jaw dropped when you talked about, you think it's ideological. And so could you talk about what do you mean by that?
Sure. We often, when we look at the U.S. doing unhelpful things in other countries. We often look for a single strategic resource like oil in Iraq, and that we think can explain the U.S. policy. Haiti does have some strategic resources, but I don't think that any of those are enough to justify U.S. policy. I think it's always that Haiti's a bad example of something, and often Haiti's a bad example of actually practicing what we preach. Going back to 1804. We had, all men are created equal in our Declaration of Independence. We obviously did not mean all. We probably meant the men part in the sense not women, but we certainly didn't mean all. And then Haitians come along and they say all means all, and we couldn't accept that because we couldn't accept our own founding principles. And I think that even going up through today, and you look at the period from 1995 to 2004, where Haitians were insisting on a democracy that really was listening to the people. And that meant challenging kind of corporate control. It meant challenging different obstacles to direct democracy. And it meant challenging the role of countries like the United States in telling people in countries like Haiti what to do. And we decided we just couldn't accept that Haiti was really being a bad example of actually having a participatory democracy in practice, and that was problematic. The other thing, this implied, I think, by the slavery, but you cannot explain any aspect of U.S. policy towards Haiti without raising the issue of racism. The racism has sometimes been quite obvious, and especially before we recognized Haiti. I mean, it was explicitly justified in racist terms, but the policy continues to have racist underpinnings, in the sense that now the way that we don't believe Haitians can choose their own destiny. They're not trusted. And it's the way that most media reports on Haiti. You're always hearing about, as you mentioned, hearing about the trouble and you're not hearing about the good things in Haiti. You're not hearing about the way that Haiti actually did build democracy for 10 years until the U.S. pulled the rug under. Instead, we just sort of say, oh, Haiti's a basket case, or Haiti's always in turmoil, which, some of that there are data points that justify that, but a lot of the justification is racist, that, here's a country run by Black people. Of course it's in turmoil.
You reminded me of many years ago. I was given the opportunity to present a paper at a conference at the Naval Academy. The conference was called Turning Attention to Africa. And I presented a paper on the media's depiction of Africa, and that was what you were saying was the substance of how we view countries that minorities are leading, that are in charge of, and yes, it's at the core of it is racism, and it's so funny. Like, how can the United States basically go in and dwarf every type of ability to be successful, and then when it fails, say, well, you're a failure. Well, you kind of set me up for failure, right? And I just think it's why is it that Haiti is just not important in the Western Hemisphere?
Yeah, one of the things I always say is that Haitians are brought into projects at the blame stage. That whether it's just a development project or a government, the decisions are made by predominantly white people in places like Washington and New York, and then when they fail, that's all of a sudden you say, okay, these are Haitians. It's a failed state. It's something to do with Haitians. I'm going to actually push back about Haiti not being important in the hemisphere. I think it actually really is important. And that's the problem. Often people say we're neglecting Haiti. I think if the United States had neglected Haiti more, Haiti would be better off. One of the things I say when people say, "Well, how can Haiti be stable?" I say, "Well, maybe we can, get a really big ship and tow it, several hundred miles further away from Miami, because we're always investing lots of money." The U.S. Embassy in Haiti was recently constructed, and I don't know if it's still true, but it was constructed. It was the second biggest U.S. embassy anywhere in the world. We have lots of law enforcement, of intelligence, of diplomatic engagement in Haiti. We've always, one example again, going back to this 2004, when after we kidnapped Haiti's president, U.S. troops secured the country, and this was a time where we were already struggling in both Iraq and Afghanistan, but we somehow still had time to occupy Haiti with U.S. soldiers. Going back to 1950, where we're in World War I, the biggest war in the history of the world at the time, huge troop commitments. We were still able to, throughout World War I and getting close to World War II, we were able to have a Marine occupation. So the U.S. is often implies or says that it neglects Haiti, but there actually is this long, consistent history of involvement, and again, in ways that aren't always helpful to the Haitian people.
And what has brought them into the news now, of course, is the assassination of the president. And so, I was watching a documentary, and it was talking about the gangs there and the parts of like Port-au-Prince and other areas in which they now control. Was that something that shocked you, or you anticipated, that you thought was coming because of the way his rule had turned out to be? Talk a little bit about that, what has come in the news and the importance of it.
Sure. There's both a long-term and a short-term explanation for the role of the gangs. The long-term explanation is that, as in anywhere else, gangs fill a vacuum when the government is not able to provide basic government services. And that includes security services, but also education, healthcare, economic development. And, the same dynamic happens in the United States and almost anywhere that you don't have. The government isn't able to provide services. And that's been happening in Haiti, at least since the late 1980s. It's been developing. There wasn't, my understanding is there wasn't huge gang activity beforehand, but that was mostly because you had a very repressive government that had a monopoly on the violence. And that since then, since I've been involved in 1995, all of the governments have struggled with increases in gang activity. They're often outmanned and outgunned. The police force in Haiti has never been adequately funded, and so the police struggle to do that. You also just have a huge economic imbalance that is generated by U.S. consumption of illegal drugs in a way that allows that generates enough money that Haitian government cannot really compete monetarily for drug cartels for the loyalty of its police officers. I've worked with many police officers who took a strong stand against drugs because they believed in it. But lots of people were vulnerable to bribes or have been vulnerable to bribes, and throughout the government for the last 25 years, people have been able to be bribed, and the government has been infiltrated by drugs, and then again that allows a free pass for the gangs. But different governments have had better success, and again, during this late 1990s, when you had a democratic success, the governments seemed to keep the gangs a little bit under control. Since then, you had a coup d'etat in 2004, and that generated a huge spike in gang activity. And then, now what you've had, the short-term issue is the current ruling party, the PHTK, has been more actively collaborating with gangs. For some of it's been kind of run-of-the-mill corruption and drug trafficking, but some of it has been direct help with repressing dissent. A report came out by a bunch of Haitian human rights organizations and Harvard Law School in April, where they looked at just there's been over 13 massacres, most committed by gangs over the last 4 years. And this human rights report that came out in April looked at 3 of those massacres and determined that they were crimes against humanity that were done by gangs with government help, and they were designed to oppress and suppress anti-government organizing. So they were carried out in neighborhoods where people were unlikely to vote for the government, and they were intended to intimidate people, to keep them from voting, and to allow pro-government gangs to take control so they could control the political activity in that neighborhood.
Wow. Any update? You hear in the news about these mercenaries that have come. Are you hearing any updates? Are they any closer to understanding what happened with the assassination?
2 different questions. Getting lots of updates. I'm not sure I'm getting closer to understanding what happened with the assassination. I think an important dynamic on this is that there are people who are involved who are good at misdirection and misinformation and are using that to hide their tracks. And so the evidence and reports that have been released, they go in several different directions, at the same time. So it's hard to figure out exactly who was involved and who actually pulled the trigger. There are lots of questions that have been asked. I mean, obviously, there's the implication of the Colombian mercenaries. Even the Colombian government is saying that they think that many of them were innocent. They had no idea what was happening, but they think that some of them were in on the plot. You have a lot of people that could have been set up. I mean, I think including a lot of the Colombians, were people who were out of work, who were sort of desperate for, meaning and for a job and things like that. Some of the Haitian Americans that were living in Florida could fit that profile, and, people who could have been easily lured in by powerful actors, and, either unwittingly participated in something or got framed for it. There's a lot of concerns. There's questions about the security team. There's, President Moïse was shot several times. His wife was shot. There appeared to be no casualties among his security detail. And there were supposed to be 25 people there. How the president got killed when no one got hurt who was trying to protect them is a good question. Several police officers, including some high level, have been put into either under arrest or put into, I guess, administrative detention. So that is certainly one of the potential areas of suspects. The other thing that Haitians keep telling me that's important, but it's been hard to actually pin anything down on this, is the implications of Haitian elites. Haiti's a very unequal society, one of the most unequal societies in the world. You have a very small but very wealthy upper class, and then very small middle class, and most people are extremely poor in Haiti. And the upper class maintains this otherwise unsustainable class structure by means of violence, by means of political manipulation. And so many Haitians are telling me that it hasn't become clear yet, but they're fairly confident that the economic elites were involved in this in some way.
Can you talk a minute about the relationship between Haitian Americans in Haiti itself? Is that a relationship where they support the country? Is there a relationship where they're left and they don't want to have anything to do with the country? Are they doing remittance back to the country? What have you noticed between those two groups?
It's a very important relationship. Haitians especially the people who left Haiti, who were born in Haiti, they keep in really close touch. A lot of them, although that's been harder to do in recent years, but a lot of them go back every year. And even second generation go back every year. They have relatives. They stay in close touch with relatives. Economically, Haitian remittances dwarfs the government budget. It dwarfs foreign aid. It dwarfs basically everything else in the Haitian economy. I mean, that is, Haiti has more than its fair share of misery, but it would have much, much more if it were not for the support that Haitian Americans are providing. Haitian Americans also do want to stay involved in establishing governance in Haiti. There's been persistent efforts to try to allow for voting of dual nationals, and for other ways of participating. There's this organization within the Haitian American community that that tries to do open letters or talk to members of Congress or do whatever they can to try to influence and support democracy back in Haiti. So yeah, it's an extremely important relationship. I think to some extent, as with any immigrant community, as you go kind of down the line and people are more generations away from being born in Haiti, I think those ties get a little bit looser. But even within two generations, I know people who are really care deeply about Haiti and are still involved. People whose grandparents left the country.
You live there, so talk about the culture. And for no one that's visit there, what is the culture like there? What are the people like there? Because when we see it again in the media, all we see is suffering. We see crying mothers. We see lack of basic water and things of that nature. But talk about, because when I was there, I enjoyed myself. There's a culture there. So talk a little bit about that for people that have never been there.
Yeah, it's as you found out, it's overwhelming in a good sense. You're constantly just immersed in it. People are, there's artwork wherever people can make it, on walls, they have these taps, which are public transportation, and they're really ornately designed and painted with, sort of very thoughtful but deep messages. There's music is everywhere. People are always singing, from kids making up bands with totally improvised instruments that they, things they picked up on the streets, right up through, a more formal music scene that's big in Haiti. It's big in North America. And one thing that I always like to tell people that, as you mentioned, that haven't been to Haiti, if you've been to almost any other Caribbean island, you've seen Haitian culture. It's kind of really funny that my wife, who also lived in Haiti, whenever we've had the opportunity to travel somewhere else, we'll be sitting in a restaurant and you look at the paintings on the wall, and it's all Haitian paintings. A lot of it's Haitians who have gone to those islands, or it's just very kind of colorful examples of kind of Caribbean art, and the Haitians are just really good at that. So and people are amazingly generous. There's a great sense of a great tradition of hospitality. I had the privilege of doing some like hiking and camping and walking around in remote areas. And, everywhere you go, people are greeting you with a smile, curious about your life, happy to share theirs. The food is wonderful. Most people don't have enough, but it's just a very, creative and spicy, interesting, cuisine. It was a real privilege to have lived there for the time I was. It's a privilege to visit there for a day or two when I can now.
Absolutely. They colonized by the French, of course, and so does the French influence still remain among the Haitian people?
Definitely. There's the most obvious is the French language, which is a little problematic. So the way that the language developed was that was under the French, that was the colonial language, and that was, what all the decisions were made. That's what education was done in. The people spoke Haitian Creole, which was a language that developed from people who were brought from different places, mostly in West Africa, and brought to Haiti on slave ships. And they kind of created their own language, Haitian Creole, that was a combination of their local languages, and with French and some English and Spanish mixed in. It's an incredibly rich language. I mean, I've been working on Haiti for now 21 years, and sometimes I think I understand a little bit about Creole, and I do if I'm listening to like a court hearing, but then I'll be talking to a friend about legal issues, and I'm kind of impressed with myself that I actually understand it. Then someone else will come in the room and they'll start joking, and I'll miss everything. They'll be on the floor laughing, and I'm like, I wish I could get these jokes. But it's a really super rich and elusive language, and lots of really clever proverbs and traditions and things like that. In general, it's that is kind of the informal language. That's what everybody speaks at home, but in formal places, including courts, including in Parliament, in higher educational settings, people speak French. And there's some good things about it, but some of the bad things is that that's been used as a way of controlling. So forever, starting with the French colonists, they just prevented most people from getting an education. So most people couldn't learn French, but all the decisions were made in this language that most people weren't able to understand. So there's a battle kind of being waged with a lot of success over the last 40 years to make Creole the much more commonly used in courts and in public discourse and media, things like that.
Great. What would you say to the average American? Why should the average American care about Haiti? Why is it important to them? Because we have in the United States, we have this very territorialism in which we think that the United States is the world, right? And so why is it important for the average person in this country?
A couple levels to that answer. One is kind of the moral answer, and I think that is that because we have been involved in creating some of Haiti's problems, that we have an obligation to be part of that solution. There's obviously the religious, as Jesus said, whatever you do to the least of my brother. I think Haiti can fit that. I think we have, through most religious practices, there is an obligation to help people like Haiti who need our help, but even more so that where we were involved in generating some of those problems. But a more sort of narrow self-interest is that the U.S. policy that's been problematic to Haiti, and it certainly caused Haitians to suffer, it doesn't make sense from the perspective of the average American. It makes sense from the perspective of rice importers, of textile manufacturers, but it doesn't make sense from the average taxpayer. And it's not a big deal, but some percentage of our taxes goes towards trying to fix Haiti up after we've wrecked it. Dealing with Haitian refugees. Dealing with drug interdiction, which is facilitated by Haiti being unstable. And, it's not a huge amount out of our weekly paycheck, but collectively it is, if we put it all together. And it's really because we have a policy that helps U.S. elites, but does not help the average American person. And the bigger picture is, and we can certainly see in the United States, where we're having some more challenges to our democracy. A lot of those things, in many of those ways, Haiti is a decade or two ahead of the United States, and not in a good way in terms of environmental degradation, in terms of the polarization and the decline of democratic structures. And if we allow that to happen in Haiti or facilitate that happening in Haiti, I think there's a good chance that those chickens are going to come home to roost for us.
Your last statement is definitely so true, and I don't know where we turn the corner in this country when everything else, even human suffering and genocide and all of those things, became irrelevant to the average person. And we become so, with such a nationalistic view that we don't understand that we are citizens of the world, and where there's suffering, and especially if we say we believe in democracy, if we believe in freedom of speech, if we believe in safety, and all of law and order is, I guess, the quote unquote phrase, right? All of us should be concerned when other people suffer, and we are our brothers and sisters keepers. And I'm just hoping that those who are listening will understand that this is just as important as your local community, because it is the community of humanity. Do you think that the United States, the Biden administration, is poised to change the trajectory of things that are happening, or is this just a low priority for them?
That's a really good question, one that a lot of us are struggling with in the current moment. I think that it is definitely a low priority for the Biden administration. I think that they have lots on their plate, and I think that they expect that they have bigger fish to fry than Haiti, and I think that is part of the problem. But I also think that the Biden administration has been pursuing policies that have been unhelpful. Perhaps it's because of this issue that they just want Haiti to go away and don't want to invest in it. But the way that they've been supporting repression in Haiti has actually made things worse than better. I think it's when the current ruling party, the PHTK is its initials, they've been involved in repression for several years and in undermining democracy. The Trump administration supported them in large part because Haiti's government supported the Trump administration's attacks against Venezuela, especially in the Organization of American States. When the Biden administration came in, a lot of us were hoping that we'd have a change of policy, and President Biden did run on a platform of returning human rights to U.S. foreign policy. So that made a lot of us optimistic, including a lot of people in Haiti. But the Biden administration has time and again passed on opportunities to put that promise of human rights into effect. Just a couple of weeks after the Biden administration was inaugurated, the term of Haiti's President Moïse was up, according to most experts in Haiti, including the Lawyers Association, the judges, churches, business groups. They all said, okay, his term is up on February 7th, 2021. President Moïse came up with an argument that he had another year left in his term that was not accepted widely in Haiti, but it was accepted by the U.S. State Department. And that proved to be decisive. That allowed him to stay in office. And, unfortunately for him, it ended up with his assassination. A lot of us felt, okay, well, that's, this is the Biden administration. They're only 2 weeks into office. Let's give him another chance. But they kept time and again, when they had the opportunity to support the PHTK party or support democracy in Haiti, they chose the PHTK party. This happened right up through the summer when the President Moïse was trying to run this constitutional referendum where he was going to remove the Senate and really concentrate political power in the presidency. And under Haiti's constitution, like the U.S., it's hard to amend. And the whole reason why you make constitutions hard to amend is you don't want a dictator to come in and run a sham election that's going to make great changes. And Haiti's constitutional amendment was exactly as unconstitutional as if President Biden or President Trump had said, I'm going to put up to a vote to remove the Senate. But the U.S. supported that, and even now, since President Moïse's death, where the Haitian people have been calling for a government, a consensus government that comes from civil society, the U.S. keeps insisting, no, we want a government run by the PHTK party, and these are the people that are going to run the elections. And so, where people were disappointed, but perhaps willing to be patient 2 weeks into the Biden administration, we're now, it's halfway through the first year in office, and you're still having the same policies, despite evidence time and again that this is just making things worse.
Wow, disappointing to say the least. What if you could give us some things to be looking out for in the coming days with Haiti, what would those things be?
The big the big question is this question of an inclusive government. And so the U.S. they ended up changing their horses in the sense that on Saturday, they changed from one person that President Moïse had appointed prime minister to a person that Moïse had named as replacement 2 days before his death. To most Haitians, that's a distinction without a difference, that they're both members of the same political movement, and they see that as a different. But what Haitians have been doing is very aggressively organizing themselves outside of the government to try to create this consensus government. The international community does not want any part of that, but Haitians keep insisting, and there's going to be a lot of pressure for that to happen. And so what I'm most interested in is to see how that balance shakes out, whether the weight of Haitian civil society is enough to convince the international community to allow this Haitian-led solution rather than an internationally imposed solution. The other thing that's interesting to me from a political U.S. political standpoint is that that members of Congress, especially Democrats, especially members of the Congressional Black Caucus, but not exclusively so, have been willing to criticize Haiti's government and U.S. support for it, which is, to me, a really interesting and promising development. I've been working on Haiti during several transitions between Democrats and Republican administrations. And one thing that's held true under all of them is that members of Congress never criticize their president over Haiti if the president's from their own party, and that happens with Democrats and Republicans alike. It's been really promising that members of Congress, Democrats, especially on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and with the leadership of Gregory Meeks, who's the chair of the House Foreign Relations Committee, House Foreign Affairs Committee, they've been willing to take a principled stand. They've been inviting Haitians to testify before their committee. They've been putting out letters, warning the administration of exactly what has happened. And I see that both promising in terms of short-term having a better Haiti policy, but I also think it's promising in the long term of having a better U.S. foreign policy. I think that it's a consequence in part of having progressives elected to Congress, and who are willing to make the connections that you were talking about before between domestic policy and international policy, and sort of saying, well, these things that we're doing overseas that are limiting democracy and are concentrating wealth in the hands of the few rather than spreading it to the many, and involving police brutality. There's a lot of parallels between what's happening in the United States, and I think people making those connections are able to articulate a better foreign policy with more credibility and with more power than they have before. So I'm looking for, obviously it's dismaying that you've had 200 years of unhelpful U.S. foreign policies, but one of the places where I do see a big sign of hope. One is obviously the Haitians are going to keep fighting. The other, though, is that we do seem to have an emerging willingness within Congress to assert a more human rights-based foreign policy.
And it seems to me it's only logical to want to have stable governments in the Western Hemisphere. I mean, I just that in itself. I mean, when you talk about from a foreign policy standpoint, I think would be most important. Now, are there other countries that have influence in Haiti as well, other than the United States?
Yes, they're right now. Who's kind of making the decisions for Haiti, including who named the new prime minister on Saturday, was a group called the Core Group that involves there's Canada, France, Brazil, and Brazil was involved because there was a peacekeeping mission in Haiti from 2004 until 2017, and Brazil was ran the military end of that, and so Brazil's been involved. Plus, Brazil has a lot of Haitians who immigrated to Brazil. Also, the Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic, as you know, shares the island of Hispaniola with Haiti, and the country's histories and people are deeply intertwined. Although the relationship has been inconsistent, but the Dominican Republic, it's wealthier than Haiti. It's about the same population, but the Dominican Republic is wealthier and more developed, and has a fairly strong influence on what goes on in Haiti, although not at the level of the United States in terms of picking who gets to be prime minister.
Now, I want to make a contrast between hope and optimism. Hope is something that we never want to lose, even in the face of defeat. But optimism is something that we believe could transpire. So, do you have hope and optimism? Talk a little bit about your feelings toward the future.
I've asked the question of hope many times to Haitians, and I almost always get the response something like, "Where there's life, there's hope," and that's kind of sums up Haitians' approach to life. And these are people with nothing, facing great odds, and they'll say, "Where there's life, there's hope." And when you hear that, I cannot have hope. With someone with much more privilege and much less to worry about. So, categorically, yes, I have hope. Where there's life, there's hope. Optimism is harder to find. I mean, I think that we have, as you discussed earlier, we're in a difficult period of world history. I think we not only have become we were nationalistic in the sense that we stopped caring about our brothers outside the country. I'm deeply concerned to the extent to which we've stopped caring about our brothers and sisters within the country. And, I think that, we can talk about specific policy prescriptions that will improve things, but I don't see any sort of systematic improvement until we can find some way of renewing the sense of community, both within our small geographical area, but also our community as Americans, and our community as citizens of the world. To me, we've just got to find a way of renewing that. I mean, obviously, lots of people have it, but it just sort of seems to have dropped to a dangerously low level in our society at this point. And so, to me, the hope where I get my optimism is looking at where people are organizing, especially young people, people of color, LGBTQ folks, lots of people that when I started working in Haiti 25 years ago, weren't organizing at a level where they had an impact. Of course, part of it was because their impact was suppressed. So some combination of overcoming the obstacles, but getting more engaged and developing more capacities that made them more effective. So that's one place that I find hope, is that people are able to articulate more, some of these ideas better. But I'm concerned that it's just not enough people. We've got to find ways of having more Americans really believe in the common good and understand that advancing the common good is self-interest in the medium and long terms.
Brian, this has been fantastic. I've learned more in this conversation than I did in my undergraduate and graduate school.
I I find that almost any time I talk to a Haitian, and including about democracy. I mean, I went to law school, so I think I thought I understood democracy. Then I went to Haiti, and you get these people, can't even write their names, but they can explain democracy so much better than I can. I mean,
that's great, and I truly appreciate all the hard work you have done throughout the years, and this calling on your life to not only work there, but to bring back the knowledge to the collective that needs to understand and needs to be mobilized. How if folks want to get in touch with you, what is the best way to do that?
So my website is it's a project blueprint, and the website is blueprint2021.org. You can send me an email, which is beconcannon@gmail.com. And one thing, if people want to keep in touch of what's going on in Haiti, I try to send the good articles, put the good articles on my Twitter feed, and there's a lot of good stuff coming out now. So it's a pretty active Twitter feed, and that is Haiti Justice. So if you just follow me there, you'll get lots of good analyses about what's going on in Haiti, especially directly from grassroots and Haitian activists.
And I will also attach those links to the show so folks can get in touch with you. Thank you, my friend. I appreciate you being here on the One Mic, One Voice show. It's been educational. It's been fun. I have to say, man, I'm sorry about the Celtics, man, but we celebrate. I got to throw in Milwaukee's been 50 years, and it's a place I was born and raised in. And man, I wish I was back there now to celebrate with them. But it's good to see a small market do big things, and hopefully this will more to come for small markets around the country.
Yeah, I'm excited by that. I try to hate the Bucks when they're beating the Celtics, but I just can't. They're just such a fun team, and they're just so good that I can't hate them. And really exciting that a small market team was able to pull it off, and they, seems like they're doing it the right way. So congratulations to Milwaukee.
Absolutely. All right, my friend. Thank you so much for being on the One Mic, One Voice show. You did bring out something that stuck out to me. This idea of when you ask the Haitians about hope. Well, the motto for South Carolina is, while I breathe, I hope. And folks, we can never lose hope. We have to stay focused. We have to believe that justice will come around if we work on it and we work together, because clearly we can make this world a much better place. And folks, as always, history will speak of us. Somewhere in the distant future, a scribe will reach down deep into the archives of our time. And what will she find? Will she find that we overcame our differences? Will she find that out of many we became one? Or will she find that we solved nothing and remain a divided peoples? Yes, history will speak of us.
All we gotta do is work together. We gotta raise our children better. We gotta stop the hate, and spread the love. One mic, one voice. You can change the world, it's your choice. One mic, one voice. You can change the world, it's your choice. One mic, one voice. You can change the world, it's your choice. One mic, one voice. You can change the world, it's your choice.
Thank you for downloading the One Mic, One Voice show. Take a moment and subscribe and share. You can find us on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, Stitcher, or any other podcasting platform. Thank you for your continued support and for your voice. You can change the world. It's your choice. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on the One Mic, One Voice show are not the views, thoughts, and opinions of our sponsors.